So we're going to finish up today with this conversation about how to evaluate tests for diagnosis, prediction, and screening. It's a challenging talk for me to give. I just finished giving a course on this, which was about 40 to 50 hours total, and now I have one. So I'll try to hone in just on the take-home messages and a few of the basic principles. I really like this area because there's so much to improve. The evaluation of diagnostic and prediction tests is, I often use the analogy, the Wild West. But I sometimes think the Wild West had more rules than what seems to be out there in the literature. One of the most challenging things in the course is to try to find a well-done study in this area. There's so few. A very tiny minority of what's published is acceptable. So there's a very, very poor understanding of how to do this in complete contrast to clinical trials and other kinds of designs where the rules of the road are pretty clear. So I'll talk about three things: the goals of testing, phases of test evaluation, and design analysis of such studies. So what kind of tests are these? Well, they can be anything. Anything you measure can be turned into a test. So it can be a device, a CT scan, an ultrasound, fecal occult blood testing, colonoscopy. It can be a biomarker, PSA, glucose tolerance test, a pregnancy test, Oncotype, MammaPrint. It can be genes, or it can be clinical history, signs and symptoms. That is a diagnostic test. In fact, that's why in medical school, doctors are taught those things. That's how you diagnose. So virtually anything you measure can be turned into something that either diagnoses or predicts or screens. So this is sort of all of medicine, right? I mean, short of actually going in there and sewing somebody up, what you're acting on is information that tells you something about the future and justifies you doing something to somebody else. So this is really at the heart of medicine, separate from the issue of, does a particular therapy work? So it's really, really important to understand both how to think about it and how to test it. So I don't think it's news to say that tests are newsworthy and they're very expensive. And all you have to do is open up the Stanford News or the New York Times every day to find reports on these things. So here's one background fact, which is that these tests take up a huge amount of healthcare spending, either directly or indirectly. So this is from a few years ago. It says a story cited a $250 billion figure for the amount wasted on unneeded tests. That's not just on tests that are administered. And then this economist goes on to say that it's actually $800 billion. One-third of all healthcare spending is wasted on unnecessary diagnostic tests, procedures, and extra days in the hospital. But this is what we get, and when we open up the Stanford publications, microchip could aid diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. And I didn't pick this out because it necessarily doesn't work. I'm just showing you an example. Here's another. Novartis joins with Google, develop a contact lens that monitors blood sugar. I see you nodding there. I don't know how far this is going or has gone or if it's been abandoned, but you see this all the time. Here's another thing from News. Simple eye scan can reveal extent of multiple sclerosis. I'll show you a little bit more background on this particular story in a minute. And then we get the downside of these tests. Okay, the PSA blood test, hyped, used for years, and then it was found it saved very few people and caused a lot of damage. This is the real downside of bad tests. Couple does bucket list, ends up broke. Fueled by false cancer diagnosis, couple sold home, went on vacation. They dissolved their retirement accounts and they came back to find out he was fine, but they were broke. So tests have consequences, and we'll be talking about those. It's both amusing and but not so amusing. There's the medical cascade after tests is not insignificant. And then you get the FDA, and we'll hear more about this in the days ahead. But the diagnostic tests fall into a big regulatory sort of black hole. They do not have the kind of structures that are around therapeutics. And the FDA is just trying to get their their arms around this. It's really a complicated area. And this is another reason why the rules of the road are not very clear, because in many ways the FDA sets structures and guidelines in place for how a lot of clinical research is done that could ultimately feed into the FDA regulatory structure. But because diagnostic tests don't have the same sort of structure as therapeutics, and in fact some even evade FDA regulation almost entirely, that's one of the reasons that people don't quite know how to evaluate them. So what are some basic facts about diagnostics? The vast majority of proposed diagnostics fail. That is, they never become part of routine healthcare. And we heard one big reason this morning, and I will be echoing that, is that they don't actually fulfill an identified need. And another reason is they just plain don't work very well. And I'll be talking about the theory behind that. For the vast majority, this outcome is completely predictable very, very early on. And yet people plow on, and we only discover this late. And it would appear, and this is based on the published literature, that many or most developers of diagnostics and predictives don't seem to understand the basic principles around their development and evaluation. So hopefully you'll get some sense of that here. So let me ask you to start. What is the goal of any of these tests, diagnostic, predictive, or screening? You can choose your flavor. How would you describe in just a sentence or a few words what the goal of this kind of testing is? Yes.
Improving patient outcome.
Improving patient outcome. Okay, that's one. Any other suggestions? Yes.
Suggest how to improve patient outcome.
How to improve patient outcome. That's interesting. Okay. So I'll put those in the same rough bucket. Others?
How to avoid litigation.
How to avoid defensive testing. Yes, avoid litigation. Dan?
Avoid toxicity.
Avoid toxicity. Okay.
Aren't they the same?
Well, they could be. So, yeah, that's another form of toxicity, yeah. So, well, actually, this group did great because almost nobody ever says improve patient outcome, and yet that is the only purpose of the tests. So that's the point, and that's the laser-like focus I keep in my course and that we will do today. If you keep your eye on this ball, you don't make all the mistakes that are made. Usually the answers I get are something about how to separate disease from non-disease people or high and low risk patients, which of course is a proximate goal, but it's a surrogate goal. At the end of the day, people have to be better off because you use that test than if you didn't use that test. That is the gold standard for testing, okay? And that's it. That's the only gold standard. Now, some might look at profits and other things like that, but we're not going to use those today. So, now, what are the different roles that these tests can play? Well, there are many. So it could be to diagnose a disease that somebody has now, and that would be what you'd call a diagnostic test. It could be picking up a preclinical condition. That is, the only way you could do it is pick it up is by doing the test, and that's a screening test. It could be identifying people at high risk for some outcome, and that can fall under a screening test, prediction, or diagnostic test, or something that occurs in the future, and that's almost always prediction. So these are very, very closely related tests. They're done in different contexts, and they have some subtly different features. And here's an example of the BNP test, different uses. It's a test that is sensitive to heart failure, and it can be used early in the diagnostic workup in the setting, in a primary care setting or in an ER. The information you might have at that time is patient history and physical exam, and you might measure the BNP, and the purpose is to indicate whether somebody, the symptoms are a function of heart failure or not. Later on in the workup, maybe in an ER when you have a chest X-ray and an ECG, you might use it as an add-on or replacement for other tests. Once the diagnosis is established and you have the echo, you might use it to monitor or predict prognosis, or you might use it to monitor disease processes as you go along. So there are many, many purposes to which a diagnostic or a predictive can be used, and it might be a diagnostic in one context, it might be predictive in another context. And for each of these purposes, you would have a different evaluation scheme. And we'll talk about that. But you have to be very, very, very clear on the purpose. And look at the other thing that we had to specify here is the setting. And we're going to spend some time on that. You have to be very clear. Is who's doing it? Is it in the ER? Is it an outpatient? Is it in the ICU? The context is really, really important. Okay? So this is the beginning of understanding how this is very, very different from explanatory or etiologic or mechanistic studies. Because the difference between those and a diagnostic or predictive test is this is the chain we have. We have a subject, we have a test context, that is where the patient is being tested. The other things that would be done if you weren't testing them, you have reasons for the test, you actually do the test, you get the result, you take an action, and those actions have consequences. Now, rarely when we're looking at therapeutics or evaluating other things, do we look as closely as we're going to look at this issue of action and consequences and context. But all of those things are going to be critical in our evaluation of diagnostics. The other thing that we don't pay as much attention to is sort of modeling or thinking rigorously about how these consequences relate to our underlying uncertainty. And this is a very crude way of showing what's called the threshold model of testing. It's called a threshold. So we have all these things that might happen after a test. You might tell somebody, well, just go home, observe you, call me if you have more symptoms. You might say you need more testing. You might say you need the reference standard or the gold standard. And often we're trying to avoid that because it might be more expensive and more morbid. If it wasn't, if this was a simple, cheap, harmless test, we wouldn't be looking for other tests. So, the understanding is that the reference test, there's some reason why we didn't use it right away. Or you can just decide that the probability of the test is so high, and this is a scale of probability. So this is how likely is it that you have the thing you're testing for, that it's so high and the issue so emergent that you have to treat immediately on the basis of the test. So this is the probability of disease, and these various cut points are decision thresholds. Now, obviously, they're not that, precisely estimated, but the basic idea is that you want to know whether the test gets you from one of these areas of probability of disease into another one. If it just moves you a little bit here, or moves you a little bit here, moves you a little bit here, that's a worthless test. But if the test is powerful enough or strong enough in the context where you're using it, such that you would change your decisions, you change your actions on the basis of the test, that's a test worth doing. And that's going to be another guiding principle.